Hey everyone! Today we're diving into a fascinating story, one that's both ancient and incredibly powerful, the story of Ezekiel, who was not only a priest but also a prophet. He lived back in the 6th century BCE, during a time of huge upheaval for the people of Israel. Now, prophets were more than just people who shared messages. They were kind of like messengers who communicated directly with God. Sometimes they'd get these messages through visions, and other times they would experience something as intense as an out-of-body journey to heaven, where they'd receive divine knowledge from God or even angels. Let's set the stage. Around 722 BCE, the northern kingdom of Israel was destroyed by the Assyrian Empire, and 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel were lost to history. A little over 100 years later, in 587 BCE, the Babylonian Empire came in and conquered the southern kingdom of Judah. This was when the great Temple of Solomon, the heart of Jerusalem, was also destroyed. Now, the prophets, including Ezekiel, didn't see these events as random tragedies. Instead, they explained that the downfall of both kingdoms was because of the sins of the Israelites, especially their idolatry, basically, worshiping false gods. In their view, God was punishing them for straying from his path. But here's where it gets interesting. The prophets didn't just deliver messages of doom and gloom. They also shared hope. They believed that at some point in the future, God would step in again during what they called the final days to restore Israel and make things right. Ezekiel, like other prophets, used powerful symbolism in his messages. His writings are a great example of what scholars now call apocalyptic eschatology, which is a fancy term for visions about the end times or the final days of human history. One of Ezekiel's most well-known visions came during the time when the Babylonians had taken many of the elite of Jerusalem, priests, nobles, and scribes, including Ezekiel himself, into captivity. This period became known as the Exile. During this time, Ezekiel had a series of vivid visions that still hold deep meaning today. One of these visions included a dramatic image of God's throne surrounded by strange, awe-inspiring creatures. Picture this, a massive storm cloud, flashing with lightning, surrounded by brilliant light. In the middle of this firestorm, Ezekiel saw 4 living creatures. They looked somewhat human but had some wild features. Each had 4 faces, a human, a lion, an ox, and an eagle, and 4 wings. Their legs were straight, and their feet gleamed like polished bronze. Under their wings they had hands, and as they moved, their wings would touch each other, almost like they were perfectly synchronized. It's no wonder artists throughout history have struggled to depict this vision. It's complex, surreal, and absolutely mind-blowing. But Ezekiel's visions didn't stop there. In another intense experience, Ezekiel was lifted by the Spirit of God and brought to the temple in Jerusalem. There, he saw something shocking, an idol, right inside the temple, which Ezekiel believed was defiling this sacred space. This idol was of the Babylonian god Tammuz, a fertility deity, whose story was all about death and rebirth. According to Ezekiel, this idolatry was the reason God allowed the Babylonians to destroy the temple. However, Ezekiel also foresaw that God would one day build a new temple, purified and free of corruption. One of Ezekiel's most famous visions is known as the Valley of Dry Bones. Imagine a vast valley littered with the bones of dead Israelites. In this vision, God tells Ezekiel to speak to these bones, saying that he will breathe life back into them and bring them to life again. The message here was clear. Even though Israel was broken and scattered, God would one day bring the people back together, restoring the nation to its former glory. This idea of resurrection later became an important part of both Jewish and Christian beliefs about the afterlife and the ultimate restoration of Israel. And now let's dive even deeper into Ezekiel's influence, especially on Jewish mysticism and Christianity. In the centuries following Ezekiel, his visions sparked something really interesting within Judaism. This gave rise to what we now know as Merkabah mysticism. The word Merkabah means to ride and refers directly to Ezekiel's vision of the divine throne chariot. As this mystical movement grew during the Hellenistic Jewish period, we started seeing a lot more emphasis on heavenly journeys. These visions went beyond Ezekiel's original experience, expanding to describe multiple layers of heaven, filled with angels and divine beings surrounding God's throne. By the Middle Ages, these mystical ideas found their way into Kabbalah, a branch of Jewish mysticism that continues to fascinate people today. Now, moving over to Christianity, Ezekiel's prophecies found a new home in the teachings about Jesus. The writers of the Gospels saw strong parallels between Ezekiel's role as a prophet and Jesus' mission. For instance, both Ezekiel and Jesus were seen as apocalyptic prophets, sharing the message that God's kingdom was coming soon. Ezekiel's vision of God sending a new spirit and a new covenant became central in Christian theology, with the idea that this covenant would now be written in the hearts of believers. This is one reason why the term, Son of Man, which Ezekiel used, became such a popular title for Jesus. It highlighted his role as the final judge who could forgive sins on earth. One cool connection between Ezekiel and the New Testament happens during the festival of Pentecost, which Luke writes about in the book of Acts. He describes Jewish pilgrims coming from all over the world to Jerusalem, just as Ezekiel had prophesied about God restoring Israel's fortunes and pouring his spirit upon them. In Luke's version of events, this is exactly what happens. God's spirit descends on the early believers, fulfilling Ezekiel's words. Then we come to John of Patmos, the Christian visionary who wrote the book of Revelation. This book is packed with echoes of Ezekiel's prophecies. John's vision focuses on the Roman Empire, which he portrays as a new version of Babylon, a symbol of oppression and evil. Just like Ezekiel, John speaks of a final battle where the enemies of God, represented by Gog and Magog, rise up against God's people. In Ezekiel's account, Gog is a person, and Magog is the land he comes from, but over time, they came to symbolize broader, future enemies of Israel. The Jewish historian Flavius Josephus even suggested that Gog and Magog represented the Scythians, fierce nomads from the Eurasian steppes. However, Ezekiel never gave a timeline for when this final battle would take place, as the timing was known only to God. Interestingly, Ezekiel was even instructed to eat the scroll containing his visions, to keep him from obsessing over when these events would unfold. Over time, Gog and Magog have been interpreted in many different ways, from the Huns and Goths to the Vikings. Even in modern times, people have tried to fit Ezekiel's prophecies into contemporary crises. For instance, during the Cold War, many referred to communist Russia as the new Gog and Magog, representing the ultimate evil forces that would bring about the end times.